You know what nobody tells you about getting older? How much you start to miss a good night's sleep. I'm talking about that deep, restful sleep where you wake up feeling like you could take on the world. The kind of sleep I used to take for granted. In my 20s and 30s, now at 83, I can tell you that finding peace at night has been one of my greatest challenges and victories. I still remember the first night I realized sleep had become my enemy. It was about a week after my 70th birthday. Martha, my wife of 47 years, had arranged this beautiful celebration with all our kids and grandkids. Tom and his family flew in from Seattle. Sarah came with her husband from Chicago. And even little Jimmy, well, not so little anymore at 43, drove up from Atlanta with those beautiful twins of his. For once, our old Victorian house in Rochester was filled with laughter again. But after everyone left, the silence was deafening. I remember lying in bed that night, staring at the ceiling fan going round and round, counting the hours as they passed. 11 p.m., 1 a.m., 3:27 a.m. By the time the sun started peeking through our bedroom curtains, those blue ones, Martha insisted, would bring tranquility to our room. I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. "Howard," Martha said to me over breakfast, her face etched with concern, "you look terrible." "Thanks, dear," I chuckled, though there was no humor in it. 13 years of marriage and you still know how to make a man feel special. She wasn't having it. "I'm serious. You haven't been sleeping right for months now. This can't go on." She was right, of course. Martha was always right. Something that took me decades to admit without my pride getting in the way. I'd been dragging myself through days, surviving on catnaps and cups of coffee, telling myself it was just part of getting older. But that morning, as I fumbled with the clasp on my watch, a simple task that suddenly felt impossible, I knew something had to change. What I didn't know then was that the struggle would lead me to discover what I now consider to be some of the most valuable wisdom of my entire life. Not about making money, though Lord knows I spent enough years chasing that. Not about fame or success or any of those things we think matter when we're young, but about something far more fundamental: how to find rest in a world and a body that seems increasingly determined to deny it to you. If you're watching this and you're anywhere near my age, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And if you're young, well, trust me, someday this will matter more to you than almost anything else. Because without sleep, life becomes a shadow of what it could be. I learned it the hard way. So today, I want to share with you the 6 things that completely transformed my sleep after 70. These aren't just tips I read in some magazine, though heaven knows Martha subscribed to enough of them. These are hard-earned lessons that came from years of trial and error, from countless sleepless nights, from conversations with doctors and specialists and other old-timers like myself, who were fighting the same battle. But before I get to those, I need you to understand something. The journey to better sleep at our age isn't just about changing your bedtime routine. It's deeper than that. It's about confronting what it means to grow older in a world that worships youth. It's about making peace with a body that doesn't always cooperate the way it once did. And most importantly, it's about finding a kind of acceptance that only comes with decades of living. I remember sitting in Dr. Friedman's office about 3 months after my 70th birthday. By then, I was lucky if I got 3 consecutive hours of sleep. I'd tried everything, or so I thought. Warm milk before bed like my mother used to make me. Those over-the-counter sleep aids that left me feeling like my head was stuffed with cotton. Even counting sheep, which only made me irritated at the imaginary animals for not doing their job. "Howard," Dr. Friedman said, peering at me over his glasses, "your tests look normal for a man your age." He had this way of saying things that made even bad news sound reassuring. "So why am I awake every night at 3 a.m.? I asked, not bothering to hide my frustration. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on that enormous mahogany desk of his. "Sleep changes as we age. Your body produces less melatonin naturally. Your circadian rhythm shifts. And let's be honest, you've got 7 decades of thoughts and worries floating around in that head of yours." I remember staring at the diplomas on his wall, thinking that all his fancy education hadn't given him any real answers for me. "So that's it. I just accept that I'll never sleep well again." That's when he said something that changed everything for me. Acceptance is actually the first step, Howard. But it's not the last. We don't give up, we adapt. Adapt, such a simple word, isn't it? But in that moment, it felt revolutionary. I wasn't failing at sleep. I was failing to adapt to a new reality. That conversation was the beginning of my journey toward the best sleep I've had since I was 50. And that's what I want to share with you today: how to adapt. How to work with your aging body instead of fighting against it. How to find that sweet peace of restful sleep, even when everything else seems to be changing. The first thing I learned, and this might sound strange, is that fighting for sleep actually pushes it further away. I used to lie in bed, growing increasingly frustrated as the minutes ticked by. Fall asleep. Damn it, I'd tell myself, as if sleep were a disobedient dog that would respond to commands. Martha would be breathing deeply beside me, lost in dreams, while I'd be calculating how many hours I had left before the alarm went off. If I fall asleep now, I can still get 5 hours and 23 minutes. The anxiety about not sleeping made it impossible to sleep. It became a vicious cycle. So the first real change I made came from an unexpected source. Our granddaughter Emma had just graduated from college with some fancy psychology degree, and she came to stay with us for a few weeks before starting her job in Boston. One night, she found me in the kitchen at 2 a.m., making a sandwich out of desperation and boredom. "Grandpa," she said, startling me so badly I nearly dropped the mayonnaise. "What are you doing up?" I told her what I'd been telling everyone, that sleep, and I had gotten a divorce. And it wasn't an amicable split. She sat me down at the kitchen table, pushed aside my sad-looking sandwich, and said, "Have you ever heard of sleep restriction therapy?" I hadn't, of course. It sounded like some kind of punishment. "It's counterintuitive," she explained, with all the confidence of someone who hadn't yet realized how little she actually knew about the world. But in this case, she was onto something. The idea was simple. Instead of spending hours in bed tossing and turning, I would restrict my time in bed to only the hours I was actually sleeping, even if that was just 5 hours a night. No going to bed at 9 p.m. and lying there until 7 a.m. If I was only sleeping from 11 p.m. to 4 a.m., then those were my new bedtime hours. "But I'll be exhausted," I protested. "Exactly," she said, with a smile that reminded me so much of her grandmother. "That's the point." And she was right. The first few nights were terrible. I felt like I was punishing myself. But slowly, something started to change. Because I was genuinely tired when I got into bed, I fell asleep faster. As the days went on, I started to extend my sleep time naturally. 6 hours, then 6.5. It wasn't just about the hours, though. It was about breaking that association between my bed and anxiety. My bed had become a battlefield, a place of stress and worry. By restricting my time there to only when I was sleeping, I was retraining my brain to associate it with rest again. I still use a modified version of this approach today. I don't get into bed until I'm truly sleepy, not just because the clock says it's bedtime. And if I wake up and can't fall back asleep within 20 minutes or so, I get up and do something quiet until I'm sleepy again. No more lying there, watching the minutes tick by, working myself into a state of panic about how tired I'll be tomorrow. That leads me to the second major change I made. And this one came from a rather embarrassing doctor's visit. About a year after my sleep troubles began, I started having these episodes where I'd wake up gasping for air. Martha said I'd stop breathing in my sleep and then suddenly jolt awake, scaring her half to death. Being the stubborn old man that I am, I ignored it for months. "Just a bad dream," I'd tell her, and roll over. But one night, I woke up with my heart pounding so hard I thought I was having a heart attack. Martha called an ambulance, despite my protests that I was fine. I was fine. In the emergency room, a young doctor who looked like he should still be in high school asked me a series of questions, and then said something that knocked me sideways. "Mr. Sullivan, have you ever been evaluated for sleep apnea?" I hadn't, and frankly, I was offended by the suggestion. In my mind, sleep apnea was for overweight people who snored loudly. I was thin to thin, according to Martha, and while I snored occasionally, it wasn't that bad, or so I thought. 2 weeks later, I found myself spending the night in a sleep lab, hooked up to more wires and monitors than a NASA astronaut. I felt ridiculous, trying to sleep with all that equipment while knowing someone was watching me on a monitor in another room. But the results couldn't be argued with. Moderate obstructive sleep apnea. I was stopping breathing dozens of times each hour, though I had no memory of it. Each time, my oxygen levels would drop, my brain would panic, and I'd partially wake up, not enough to remember it, but enough to prevent me from reaching the deep, restorative stages of sleep. The solution was a CPAP machine, this contraption that pushes air through your nose to keep your airway open. I hated it at first. The mask made me feel claustrophobic. The noise bothered Martha, and there's nothing dignified about strapping that thing to your face every night. I look like Darth Vader. I complained to Martha after the first night. "Well, you sound much better than Darth Vader," she replied, kissing my cheek, and I actually got to sleep through the night without worrying you were going to stop breathing. It took about 3 weeks to get used to it, but the difference was remarkable. I started dreaming again, vivid, beautiful dreams that I could remember in the morning. I had more energy during the day. The brain fog that I'd attributed to just getting older began to lift. Now, I'm not saying everyone over 70 has sleep apnea, but so many of us do, and we dismiss the symptoms as just part of aging. Snoring, gasping, dry mouth in the morning, waking up unrefreshed, daytime fatigue. These aren't just annoying, they're warning signs. And the treatment, while not perfect, can be life-changing. The third thing that transformed my sleep came from an unlikely source: my son Tom's divorce. Now, that might sound strange, but bear with me. When Tom's wife Jessica left him for her CrossFit instructor, and yes, that's as cliche as it sounds, he was devastated. 30 years of marriage, 2 kids raised together, and suddenly he was alone in that big house in Seattle. He started calling me late at night, which was even later for him on the West Coast. At first, I was just happy to be awake when the phone rang, able to be there for my son when he needed me. But as the weeks went on, I noticed something. On the nights when Tom called, pouring out his heart about the unfairness of it all, I slept better afterward. It wasn't that his pain gave me peace, quite the opposite. It broke my heart to hear my 53-year-old son crying over the phone. But there was something about those deep, meaningful conversations that seemed to settle my soul. One night, after particularly heavy talk about forgiveness and moving forward, I slept for 8 straight hours, something I hadn't done in years. The next morning, I mentioned it to Martha. "Of course you did," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "You connected." Martha had been going to this women's group at our church for years, and apparently, they talked a lot about the importance of connection, especially as you age. She explained that isolation and loneliness can wreak havoc on sleep, and that meaningful human connection, not just small talk, but real, vulnerable conversation, releases all sorts of chemicals in your brain that help you relax and feel secure. I'd never thought about it that way, but it made sense. After I retired from the accounting firm, my social circle had shrunk considerably. Most days, my only real conversations were with Martha, the cashier at the grocery store, and maybe the mail carrier if I happened to be outside when he came by. So I started making a conscious effort to connect more deeply with people. I rejoined the men's group at church that I'd drifted away from. I started meeting my old colleague Frank for lunch every Wednesday. I even swallowed my pride and called my brother Robert, who I hadn't spoken to in nearly a decade over some dispute about our mother's china cabinet. That seems so trivial now. Each of these connections, each genuine conversation, became a thread in a safety net that seemed to catch me as I fell into sleep. There's something primally reassuring about knowing you're not alone in this world, that you matter to someone, that your existence is witnessed. I know it's not always easy. Friends die, families move away, mobility becomes an issue, but I promise you, finding ways to maintain meaningful human connection is as important to your sleep as any pill or breathing machine. Call an old friend. Join a group at your local senior center. Strike up a real conversation with your neighbor. Your sleeping self will thank you. The fourth change I made was perhaps the most challenging, because it meant confronting one of my longest-standing habits, my evening drink. For almost 50 years, I'd ended each day with a glass of scotch, sometimes 2. It started during my early days at the firm, when the partners would gather for drinks after a big client meeting. It became my signal to myself that the workday was over, that I could relax. After I retired, that evening ritual became even more important. It was the punctuation mark at the end of the day. My personal transition into evening. Martha never liked it much, especially after her brother Ed died of liver failure, but she tolerated it, as long as I kept it to just one. Except, as the years went on, just one sometimes became just two, particularly on nights when sleep seemed most elusive. It was actually Dr. Friedman who brought it up during a regular checkup. "How much are you drinking these days, Howard?" he asked, with that carefully neutral tone doctors use when they're trying not to sound judgmental. I gave my standard answer, the one I gave everyone, including myself. "Just a nightcap to help me sleep." He nodded, making a note in my file. "And does it help you sleep?" "I mean, of course," I said, perhaps too quickly. "Puts me right out." "And then what happens around 2 or 3 a.m.? I stared at him, feeling suddenly exposed. How did he know about my nightly date with the ceiling fan at 3 a.m.? "Alcohol might help you fall asleep," he explained gently, "but it severely disrupts your sleep architecture, particularly REM sleep, which is crucial for cognitive function." He went on to explain that as we age, our bodies metabolize alcohol differently. The nightcap that merely relaxed me in my 50s was now wreaking havoc on my sleep cycle. It was causing those middle-of-the-night awakenings that left me staring at the darkness until dawn. I'd like to tell you I quit cold turkey after that conversation, but that would be a lie. I tried to bargain with myself, switching from scotch to wine, telling myself it was healthier. I tried limiting my drinking to weekends only. I tried everything except the one thing that would actually work: stopping completely. It was Martha who finally made the difference. Not by nagging. She'd learned decades ago that nagging just made me more stubborn. Instead, she simply started going to bed earlier, leaving me alone with my drink and my thoughts. "I'm not trying to punish you," she said when I called her on it, "but I sleep better when I go to bed by 10, and I can't fall asleep with you coming to bed later, smelling like a distillery." Those evenings alone, with just the TV and my scotch for company, became surprisingly depressing. And when I really started paying attention, I couldn't deny the correlation between my drinking and my terrible sleep. So, after 50 years, I gave up my evening drink. The first few weeks were rough. I felt oddly bereft, as if I'd lost a friend. But within a month, the change in my sleep was undeniable. I still woke up sometimes in the night. That's just part of aging, but I could usually fall back asleep. And when I did sleep, it was deeper, more satisfying. Now, I'm not saying everyone needs to become a teetotaler, but if you're struggling with sleep, taking an honest look at your relationship with alcohol might be one of the most important things you can do. Maybe try going without for just 2 weeks and see what happens. You might be surprised. The fifth thing that changed my sleep for the better might seem obvious, but it was surprisingly difficult to implement: establishing a consistent routine. When you work for 50 years, your days have a built-in structure. The alarm goes off at the same time, you catch the same train, you eat lunch at roughly the same hour, then retirement comes, and suddenly all those external scaffoldings of time fall away. At first, it feels like freedom. No alarm clock, no rush hour commute. You can stay up watching old movies until 2 a.m. if you want to, then sleep until noon. And I did exactly that, especially in the early days of retirement. Martha and I took a month-long trip to Europe, jumping from one time zone to another. When we came home, I fell into a pattern of staying up late reading or watching TV, then sleeping late into the morning. It felt like a well-deserved break from decades of rigid schedules. But my body wasn't thanking me for this newfound freedom. In fact, it was getting increasingly confused about when it was supposed to be awake and when it was supposed to be asleep. It was actually our dog Winston who helped me see the light on this one. Despite being almost as old as me in dog years, Winston never had trouble sleeping. Every night at 9:30, he'd get up from his spot by the fireplace, stretch, and look at us expectantly. This was his signal that it was time for his last trip outside before bed. By 10, he'd be curled up in his bed, and nothing short of an earthquake or a meat truck driving through the living room could wake him until 6:30 the next morning. Winston doesn't have insomnia, I remarked to Martha one night as we watched him settle into his perfect canine sleep. Winston doesn't stay up watching CNN until midnight, change what time he eats dinner every night, or take 3-hour naps in the afternoon. She replied, raising an eyebrow at me over her knitting. She had a point, so I decided to be more like Winston. I established a firm bedtime and wake-up time 7 a.m. and 11 p.m. and stuck to them religiously. 7 days a week. No more sleeping in on weekends. No more afternoon naps that stretched from after lunch until dinner. The first week was horrible. My body, accustomed to its erratic schedule, rebelled. I'd lie awake until 1 a.m., then drag myself out of bed at 7 feeling worse than before. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, my internal clock began to reset itself. By the third week, I was starting to feel naturally sleepy around 10:30 p.m. By the end of the month, I was waking up just before my alarm. My body had remembered what it knew all along, that it functions best with rhythm and predictability. This consistent schedule also helped me implement another key change: getting proper exposure to light. Our bodies are designed to take cues from sunlight. Morning light signals that it's time to be alert and active. Darkness tells our brains to start producing melatonin, the hormone that helps us sleep. But as we age, we often spend less time outdoors. Our eyes become more sensitive to light, so we wear sunglasses or stay inside. Many of us no longer commute to work, so we miss that morning light exposure that used to come naturally. I made it a point to spend at least 30 minutes outside every morning, regardless of the weather. During Minnesota winters, when it's still dark at 7 a.m. and the temperature is often below zero, this meant bundling up and sitting on our enclosed porch with all the lights on. Not ideal, but better than nothing. In the summer, it meant morning walks with Winston, my face turned up to the sun like an old flower seeking warmth. And in the evening, I began dimming the lights in our house around 9 p.m. We invested in some amber reading lamps that emit less of the blue light that suppresses melatonin. I even, and this was perhaps the greatest sacrifice, stopped looking at my iPad in bed, a habit that had been particularly hard to break. These changes in light exposure, combined with my consistent sleep schedule, helped realign my circadian rhythm, that internal clock that gets so easily disrupted as we age. The sixth and final change that transformed my sleep was perhaps the most profound, because it wasn't just about sleep, it was about how I approached life itself. For much of my life, I'd been a worrier. As the oldest of 5 children, I'd grown up with a keen sense of responsibility, always trying to anticipate problems before they rose. This served me well in my career. Clients appreciated my thoroughness, my ability to spot potential issues in their financial planning. But in retirement, with fewer external problems to solve, my mind turned inward, finding new things to worry about: health concerns, family dynamics, the state of the world. These worries would surface most persistently at night, when there were no distractions to keep them at bay. I'd lie awake cataloging my fears, both rational and irrational. What if that pain in my side was something serious? What if the stock market crashed and our retirement savings evaporated? What if Martha, who was 5 years younger than me, died first, leaving me alone? It was Martha who suggested I try meditation. Now, I was skeptical, to put it mildly, in my mind. Meditation was for hippies and Hollywood types, not for practical Midwestern accountants with both feet firmly on the ground. Don't call it meditation if that bothers you, Martha said, handing me a book she'd gotten from the library. Call it quiet time or thinking or whatever you want. Just try it. The book sat on my nightstand for weeks before I finally opened it. It was a simple guide to mindfulness meditation, written by a former business executive who'd found it helpful for stress. No crystals, no chanting, no sitting cross-legged on the floor, which my knees would have protested strongly against anyway. I started with just 5 minutes each evening, sitting in my recliner, focusing on my breath. It felt awkward and pointless at first. My mind would race from thought to thought, and I'd end the 5 minutes feeling like I'd failed at yet another thing. But I kept at it. partly out of stubbornness and partly because I'd promised Martha I would give it a fair try. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift. I started to recognize my thoughts for what they were, just thoughts, not reality. I began to notice the patterns, how one worry would lead to another in a predictable chain. And most importantly, I learned to bring my attention back to my breath without judging myself for getting distracted. This simple act of returning, over and over again, became a kind of training. It taught me that I could choose where to place my attention, that I wasn't at the mercy of every thought that floated through my mind. After a few months, I extended my practice to 15 minutes, then 20. I also began using a shorter version when I'd wake up in the night, just focusing on my breath, until I drifted back to sleep, rather than engaging with whatever worry had awakened me. The change wasn't dramatic or sudden, but over time, I noticed that those middle-of-the-night panic sessions became less frequent. When worries did arise, I could acknowledge them without being consumed by them. Yes, I'm concerned about that doctor's appointment tomorrow, I'd think, and now I'm going to focus on my breath again. This practice, this ability to be present with what is, without immediately trying to fix it or fight it or flee from it, has changed not just my sleep, but my experience of aging itself. Because here's the truth that took me so long to accept. Perfect sleep, like perfect anything, is a young person's game. At 83, I still don't sleep the way I did at 30, or even at 60. I wake up to use the bathroom most nights. Sometimes my arthritic hip wakes me at 4 a.m., and I have to readjust and find a comfortable position. Occasionally, I still have nights where sleep is elusive, where I watch the numbers on the clock change while Martha breathes peacefully beside me. But these disruptions no longer define my nights or ruin my days. They're just moments in time, passing experiences in this incredible journey of being alive for 8 decades. If you take nothing else from this old man's ramblings, take this: sleep matters. It's not a luxury or a sign of laziness. It's fundamental to your health, your cognition, your emotional well-being. Advocate for yourself. Get help if you need it. Make the changes, even the difficult ones. But also know that perfect sleep, like perfect anything, is not the goal. The goal is to make peace with your changing body, to adapt rather than fight, to find rest even in imperfection. I know this now, in my bones, in a way I couldn't have understood when I was younger. Each night, as I close my eyes, I think of something my grandfather used to say: every day above ground is a good day. At 83, I know he was right. Every morning that I open my eyes, no matter how I've slept, is a gift beyond measure. So if you're lying awake at night, watching the ceiling fan go round, know that you're not alone. There are millions of us out here in the darkness, breathing alongside you. And with a few changes, some small, some not so small, you might just find your way back to the deep, healing sleep your body craves. It took me nearly a decade of struggle to find these answers. My hope is that by sharing them with you today, your journey might be a little easier, your nights a little more peaceful. Because if there's one thing I've learned in 83 years, it's that we're all in this together, awake or asleep, until the final rest comes for us all. And with that thought, not morbid, but comforting in its inevitability, I wish you sweet dreams, my friends, sweet dreams.